The wind was cold that evening, carrying fine dust across the empty land. The sky was painted in deep red and gold as the sun began to sink. At the far edge of the village, past old stone walls and forgotten paths, there was a small cemetery. It was quiet there, always quiet. Only the sound of the wind and the faint rustle of dry grass could be heard. She sat on the ground beside a simple grave. Her knees were drawn close to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. The stone in front of her was worn, the name carved in her people's language. She traced the letters slowly, again and again, as if touching them could bring him back. Her lips moved, whispering words no one else could hear. It was the same every evening, the same ritual. She came here when the light began to fade, stayed until darkness swallowed the land, then returned to her small home. The villagers had stopped asking her why she did it. They thought she was trapped in the past. They told her, "It has been too long, you must let go." But she could not. This grave was all she had left of him. He had been her mate, her protector, the one who made her feel safe in a world that was never kind. And now he was only a memory carved into stone. She lowered her head and closed her eyes. The cold air stung her skin, but she didn't move. She remembered the day he was brought back wrapped in a gray cloth, silent and heavy. They told her he had died far from home, in the middle of a battle that wasn't theirs. They told her he had fought for others, not for himself, and she had never understood why. Her people avoided the graveyard. They said the dead should rest alone, but for her, the thought of him alone in the ground was unbearable. So she came every day. The rest of the village moved on, but she remained here, bound by something stronger than time. Tonight felt different, though. The air carried a strange heaviness somewhere far behind her. A faint crunch of footsteps broke the silence. Her hands froze on the stone. No one came here, no one but her. The sound grew closer, slow and steady. Her heart beat faster. She turned her head slightly, ready to tell whoever it was to leave her alone. But the figure approaching was not one of her people. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark coat. The face was pale in the fading light. The hair short and the eyes strange eyes, sharp and human. She stiffened, every muscle in her body tense. Humans were not common here. They came only with trade ships or war patrols, and never alone. So why was one here, walking into the quiet graveyard at dusk? He stopped a few steps away, not speaking. His gaze moved from her to the stone in front of her. Then, without asking, he walked closer and lowered himself to one knee beside the grave. The air between them was heavy with something unspoken. She felt her throat tighten. This was her place, her moment with the one she had lost. And now a stranger, a human of all things, had stepped into it. "What do you want?" she asked softly, her voice guarded. The human didn't answer right away. His hand reached out, brushing the dirt from the edge of the stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost careful. "I knew him," he said, her breath caught. She stared at him, searching for a lie, but his eyes were steady, his words too calm to be false. "You knew him?" she repeated. The human nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the grave. "He saved my life," he said. A long time ago, a wave of confusion and anger passed through her. If this was true, why had he never come before? Why now, after all these years of silence? Her fingers curled into the dirt. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper now. The human looked up at her for the first time. The dying light caught the lines on his face. He looked tired, worn by years she could not see. "I came to tell you something," he said quietly, "but only if you want to hear it." She stared at him for a long moment. The grave between them felt like a barrier. Part of her wanted to tell him to go, to leave her and the memory of her mate untouched, but another part, small, trembling, wanted to know, If he had truly been there in those final moments, then he might know what her mate's last words were. Words she had never been told. The wind moved around them, carrying a deep silence. Finally, she nodded once, barely. The human shifted, sitting on the cold ground beside her. And with the fading light casting long shadows over the grave, he began to speak. The human's voice was steady, but there was a weight in it. He did not look at her. His eyes stayed on the stone, as if speaking to the one buried beneath. I was young, he began, and foolish. Too sure of myself, he gave a small, bitter laugh. That day, I thought I would die. She stayed silent, every part of her focused on his words. The wind seemed to slow, the cold air around them thick with unspoken memory. We were ambushed. He continued, not by your people, but by raiders' beasts with no flag, no honor. His hand curled into a fist. My unit was trapped, pinned between two ridges, and there was no cover. He paused for a moment, drawing in a slow breath. And then, he appeared. Her heart tightened. She could almost see it in her mind, him standing there, brave and stubborn as she remembered. He didn't know me. He didn't have to help, the human said, but he moved like it was the only choice. He had the man's voice dropped lower, almost as if he was speaking to himself now. He cut through them, fast, but he was outnumbered. I tried to follow, but he shoved me back, told me to run, told me to get my men to safety. The human's jaw clenched, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers. I ran, he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. I hate myself for it. But I did. He swallowed hard. We made it out alive, but when we returned for him, it was too late. Her hands shook where they rested on her knees. She wanted to be angry at this man for leaving her mate behind, but there was no arrogance in his voice. Only guilt that had carved itself deep into him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fading light wrapped the cemetery in long shadows, the silence pressing down between them. Finally, she asked in a low voice, why? After all this time, you here now? The human looked down at the dirt, his fingers tracing the ground beside the stone. Because I couldn't face this place before, he said. I told myself I would come. But the years passed, and I kept finding excuses. His lips pressed together. Then I heard the rumors. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Rumors? That you come here every day, he said quietly. That you haven't moved on. Just like me. She turned away, her gaze fixed on the grave. And you think that means we are the same? She asked, her voice sharp. The man shook his head slowly. No, I think it means I understand. She closed her eyes for a moment. The cold was sinking into her bones, but she didn't move. Part of her wanted him gone's presence, stirred feelings she had buried for years. But another part, one she didn't want to admit existed, felt something else. Relief, maybe, that someone else carried the weight of that day too. The human shifted, pulling something from his coat pocket. It was a small, metal tag, simple, dented. The kind soldiers wore. I kept this, he said. Holding it out, her breath caught when she saw the mark on it, his name, her mate's name. She reached out slowly, her fingertips brushing the cold metal before taking it in her palm. It felt heavier than it should. I should have given it to you long ago, the human said softly. She held the tag to her chest, her throat tight. The wind blew around them. Again, carrying a faint sound from far away, a shout in the distance. The human's head turned slightly, scanning the shadows. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of caution in them. You're being watched, he murmured. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew the village didn't approve of her sitting at the grave so much, but a human's presence here, that was something they would not ignore. They don't like you here, she whispered. The man gave a short, humorless smile. That's mutual. He stood slowly, glancing around, then looked down at her. They may try to stop you from coming here, he said, And if they do, I will be here. She frowned. Why? The human met her eyes with a steadiness that made her chest feel tight. Because he saved me, he said, his voice low but firm. And because I think he would want me to make sure you're safe. Her breath caught. It had been so long since anyone had spoken about what her mate would have wanted. For a moment, the cold didn't feel so sharp. For a moment, she felt less alone. The human stepped back, his eyes scanning the cemetery one last time. I'll see you tomorrow, he said, then turned and walked away into the deepening dusk. She sat there, the metal tag warm in her palm from her grip. Her mind was tangled with questions. She didn't know if she wanted him to return, or if she was afraid that he actually would. And yet, as she looked toward the path he had taken for the first time in years, she didn't dread the coming of tomorrow. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the village. Its light was pale, weak. Touching the old walls and dusty paths, she stood at the small window of her home, the metal tag still in her hand. She had not slept much, her mind replaying every word the human had spoken. Her mate's name, his voice saying it, the weight of the tag in her palm. It all felt too real to be a dream. She told herself she wouldn't go to the grave today. She didn't want the human to think she was waiting for him. But when the evening came, her feet carried her there anyway. The sky was painted in soft orange, and the air smelled faintly of rain. She walked the familiar path, her steps slow. And when she reached the cemetery, he was already there. The human was kneeling beside the grave, his head bowed. He looked different in the daylight, less like a shadow, more like a man carrying too many years on his shoulders. She stopped a few steps away. Unsure if she should speak, he looked up and gave a small nod, as if he had known she would come. I've been thinking, he said quietly. His hand rested on the stone, tracing the letters carved into it. I owe him my life, but that's not enough. She frowned, not understanding. What do you mean? The human's gaze shifted to her, steady and serious. I made a promise to him, even if he couldn't hear it, he said, that I'd see you safe. Always. Her chest tightened. It was dangerous to speak like this. Promises meant ties. Ties meant risk. Safe? She asked, her tone almost bitter. No one is safe here. The human's jaw tightened. Then I'll change that. She shook her head. You don't know this place. You don't know my people. I know. Enough, he replied, his voice low but firm. There are people watching you. And me? And they don't like what they see. She hesitated, glancing toward the village. She had felt it. Two eyes on her when she walked, whispers at her back. Her visits to the grave had always been tolerated, but now, with him here, the tolerance was breaking. They'll make you leave, she said, or worse. The human's eyes narrowed slightly. Let them try, for a moment. The wind was the only sound between them. Then, without warning, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He held it out to her. She hesitated before taking it. Inside were small silver discs, currency from the human trade routes. She looked at him in confusion. Why give this to me? His voice was steady. Because, if they cut you off, you'll need a way to survive. Her fingers tightened around the pouch. She had not held money of that kind in years. It was rare, valuable, and dangerous to keep. You think giving me this will fix everything? She asked. No, he said, but it will give you a choice. She stared at him for a long moment. Part of her wanted to hand the pouch back, to tell him to leave before trouble came. But another part, a quiet, fragile part, was afraid to let go of the first person who had looked at her with something other than pity. They sat in silence for a while. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. Finally, she asked the question that had been heavy in her mind since yesterday. When he was dying, did he say anything else? The human looked at the stone for a long time before answering. Yes. He said softly, he said your name. And then he said, tell her I'll wait. Her breath caught, her throat closing. The words broke something inside her and mended something else at the same time. Her eyes burned, but she didn't look away from the grave. The human didn't press her to speak. He simply stayed there, quiet and steady, and for the first time since that day. She didn't feel entirely alone in her grief. But as the darkness began to settle over the cemetery, she noticed movement in the distance. 2 figures standing near the path to the village, unmoving, watching. The human's gaze followed hers, his expression tightening. They're not here to pay respects, he murmured. She felt her heart sink. They want to see if I leave with you, Shay said quietly. Then don't, the human replied. Not tonight. She looked at him, uncertain. What about you? He gave a faint, tired smile. I'll take the long way back. He stood, giving the grave one last look before stepping away into the darkness. She stayed until the figures at the edge of the path disappeared, when she finally turned toward her home. The leather pouch was still in her hand, heavy, real, and dangerous like the man who had given it to her. She didn't know why, but as she walked, she realized something. If he came back tomorrow, she wouldn't tell him to leave. The days after that evening felt heavier. The air in the village carried a strange weight. It wasn't just in her head. People really were watching her. Every time she went to the well, she felt eyes on her. Back, every time she returned home, she noticed shadows that vanished when she turned. At night, she began to hear footsteps outside her small house. They were slow, deliberate, and they never knocked. She would sit in the dark, clutching the small leather pouch the human had given her. Her heart would pound until the footsteps faded into the distance. It was a warning, one she didn't need to hear twice. The human still came to the grave every evening. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but his presence felt like a wall between her and the whispers. When he was there, the shadows stayed away. One evening, the wind was colder than usual. The sky was clouded, the sun a pale ghost sinking behind the hills. She arrived at the cemetery to find him already standing by the grave, but his face was tense, his eyes scanning the surrounding land. They're getting bolder, he said. Quietly, without greeting, she frowned. Who? The ones watching you, he replied. They were following me on the way. Here didn't even try to hide it. Her stomach turned. The village had its own laws that allowed quiet cruelty without open bloodshed. If they decided she was a danger to their order, they would make her disappear, and with a human involved, it could be much worse. You should stop coming, she said suddenly. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she forced them out. They'll blame you and me. The human shook his head, his voice firm. Blame me for what? Sitting by a grave, talking to a woman they already treat like an outcast. She looked at him, frustration mixing with fear. You don't understand. My people don't forgive what they see as betrayal. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then maybe they should see that betrayal has teeth. Before she could answer, a sound cut through the cold air. Voices, low and steady, coming from beyond the old stone wall. The human turned his head slightly, listening. Her heart pounded in her ears. They're here, she whispered, from behind the wall. 3 figures stepped into view, villagers, armed with short spears and curved knives. Their eyes didn't move to her. They were fixed on the human. One of them, an older man with a scar down his cheek, stepped forward. You don't belong here, he said in her language, his tone sharp. The human's gaze stayed locked on him, though he clearly didn't understand the words. The older man switched to the trade tongue. Slow and deliberate. You will leave this place, he said to the human. The human's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. I'll leave when I'm ready. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. This is not your fight, human, he said, "Go back to your own kind before you bleed for someone else's grave." The human stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "He saved my life," he said. "That makes it my fight." The villagers' hands tightened around their weapons. She could feel the air between them crackling with tension. "Please," she whispered to the human. "Don't do this here." But he didn't back down. He took one more step forward. Placing himself between her and the armed men, the scarred man gave a humorless smile. "You think you can protect her from us?" The human didn't smile back. "I don't think," he said. I know for a moment it felt like the air would explode into violence. But then, one of the younger men muttered something to the scarred one. The older man's gaze flicked. Between them, measuring, finally, he stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. Turning away, the others followed him into the shadows, their footsteps fading into the cold night. The human didn't move until they were gone. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were sharp. "They're testing us," he said. "Next time, they won't talk first." Her throat felt tight. "You should go," she whispered. "Not a chance," he replied that night. She didn't sleep. Every creak of her small home sounded like someone stepping inside. She clutched the metal tag of her mate in one hand, the pouch of silver in the other. Her mind kept returning to the human standing between her and the spears. And for the first time in years, she realized she was more afraid of losing him than of what her people might do. The next 2 days passed in a slow, heavy silence. The human didn't come to the grave during the daylight, but at night. She would hear a faint knock on her door, 3 soft taps, the same each time. When she opened it, he would be there. Just long enough to ask if she was safe, then he would vanish into the shadows again. It was the 3rd evening when trouble finally came. The sun had just dropped below the hills, the sky fading into deep purple. She was walking home from the well, the leather pouch hidden under her robe. The path was empty till a shape moved in the corner of her eye. Then another. 2 figures stepped out from behind the old wall. Blocking her way, she froze, her heart kicking hard in her chest. They weren't strangers, both were men from the village, the kind who laughed loudly when others were afraid. One of them smiled in a way that made her stomach turn. "You've been busy," he said, in her language, his tone mocking. "Sharing your grief with off-worlders now." She tried to step past them, but the other man shifted, blocking her again. Their hands were empty, but their bodies carried the weight of violence. "You think we don't see?" The first man continued. "You think we'll let you bring him here, to watch us, to judge us?" Her mouth went dry before she could speak. A voice came from behind them, deep, steady, and unmistakable. "Move," the human said. The 2 men stiffened, turning slowly. The human was walking toward them, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on theirs. He wasn't armed, but something in his presence made the air heavy. One of the men snorted. "This isn't your place, human." The human kept walking, closing the distance. "It became my place," he said, "the day your people let a man die for mine." The first man's smirk faded, replaced by something colder. "You think that gives you the right to walk here? To take what you want?" The human stopped just close enough that his shadow touched theirs. "I haven't taken anything," he said evenly, "but I will take her home now." For a long moment, no one moved. The second man shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice low. The human's reply was just as quiet. "Then try and stop me." The tension snapped like a rope. The first man lunged forward, his hand grabbing at the human's coat, in one swift motion. The human caught his wrist and twisted, forcing him down to one knee. The man cried out, the sound echoing off the stone walls. The second rushed forward, but the human stepped aside and shoved him hard, sending him stumbling into the dirt. "You've had your warning," the human said, his voice like steel. "Don't follow us." He turned to her, his eyes softening just enough to make her breath catch. "Come," he said. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up, following him down the path behind them. The two men shouted something she couldn't make out, but neither dared to. "Come closer." They didn't speak until they reached her door. She turned to him, her voice unsteady. "You shouldn't have done that." His jaw clenched. "I'm not letting them hurt you." She shook her head. "Now, they'll come for you too." His reply was simple. Without hesitation, "Let them." She looked at him for a long moment. The fear in her chest was tangled with something else, a strange warmth that she didn't want to name. "I don't want you to die for me," she whispered. He gave a faint, tired smile. "Then we'll have to make sure I don't." That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak and whisper of the wind made her think of boots outside her door. But when she peeked through the small gap in the shutters, she saw him there, leaning against the wall, silent, watching the street, guarding her. And in that moment, she realized something that unsettled her more than any threat from the villagers. She no longer visited the grave just for the one she had lost. She went because of the man who still stood beside it. But deep inside, she also knew this could not go on without blood being spilled. And in this village, blood always fell where the rules were broken, the morning after the fight on the path. The village felt different. There was no laughter in the streets, no quiet chatter near the well. The air was thick, heavy. As if everyone was waiting for something to happen, she stayed inside most of the day, sitting by the small window, watching the empty road. The human didn't come during daylight, but she knew he was close, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. Watching, when evening came, she couldn't bring herself to go to the grave. Her hands shook as she lit a small lamp and set it by the wall. The light flickered across the metal tag in her palm. She was tracing the letters again when she heard it, a soft scrape outside her door. Followed by low voices, her heart jumped. She stood slowly, moving toward the door. Before she could reach it, the wood burst inward. Two men stepped inside, their faces shadowed by hoods. One grabbed her arm. The other yanked the pouch of silver from her belt. She gasped, struggling. "Let go." But their grip only tightened. "You've brought shame here." One of them hissed in her language, talking to the offworlder, walking with him in the streets. The second man shoved her toward the door. "You'll leave tonight, before he finds you. You'll never come back." Her feet scraped against the floor as they dragged her outside. The night air was cold, the streets empty. They pulled her toward the edge of the village. Toward the narrow path that led to the barren hills, she fought against them, kicking, but one struck her across the face. Her knees buckled, her vision swimming, and then a shadow moved at the end of the street, tall, steady, walking with the kind of purpose that made both men pause. The human, he didn't run. He didn't shout, he simply kept walking. His gaze locked on them. "Let her go," he said. His voice low, but carrying through the cold air. One of the men barked a laugh. "This isn't your concern." The human didn't slow. "It's my only concern." The second man pushed her forward, toward the hills. "Stay back, human," he growled. But the human didn't stay back. In a blur of movement, he closed the distance, his hand catching the arm of the man who held her. With one sharp twist, the man cried out. Releasing her, she stumbled back, clutching her arm. The other attacker lunged with a short knife. The human caught his wrist before the blade could reach him. Slamming his elbow into the man's ribs, the man gasped, dropping the knife. It clattered to the dirt. The human kicked it away, then stepped forward, driving both men back toward the wall. "You want me?" he said coldly. "Not her." The two men exchanged a look, breathing hard, but neither moved to fight again. Instead, they spat curses under their breath and retreated into the shadows. The human stayed still, watching, Until they were gone, only then did he turn to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now. She shook her head, though her cheek throbbed where she'd been struck. "I told you they'd come," she whispered. "And I told you I'd be here," he replied. He reached into his coat, pulling out the leather pouch they had taken. Her eyes widened. "You got it back." "They won't be using it," he said simply, handing it to her. Her fingers closed around it, but her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. He looked toward the dark hills, then back at her. "They won't stop," he said. "They think fear will keep you quiet. They think fear will make me leave." She swallowed hard. "What will you do?" His eyes met hers, steady and unshaken. "I'll stay," he said, "as long as it takes." Something in her chest shifted then. For years, she had carried her grief alone, keeping the world at a distance. Now, there was someone who refused to stay away, no matter how dangerous it became. It was terrifying, and it was comforting. They walked back together through the silent streets. When they reached her home, he stopped outside, glancing toward the rooftops. "I'll watch from here tonight," he said. She hesitated at the door. "You don't have to." "I do," he cut in gently, "because if I don't, they'll try again." She stepped inside, closing the door but leaving it unlocked. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. And for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking only of the grave when she lay down. She was thinking of the man outside, standing guard in the cold night air. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this: if they came for her again, he would be there, and this time, he might not just protect her, he might change everything. She barely slept, not because of fear, but because she kept listening for his footsteps outside. Every so often, she would peek through the shutters and see him there, leaning against the wall, still and silent. He didn't move much, only scanning the dark streets with the eyes of someone who had learned long ago never to rest fully. When dawn broke, the village stirred. Doors opened, people stepped out, pretending not to notice the humans still standing guard at her home. But their glances were quick and sharp. Whispers followed in his wake when he finally walked toward the cemetery. She knew the whispers were warnings. Soon the elders would act. By late afternoon, word reached her door. One of the women from the well came to advise her. "You should tell the off-worlder to leave." The woman said coldly, "The elders have decided. He will not see another sunrise here." The words struck her like a stone. "What do you mean?" she asked. The woman only shrugged. "It is better you don't watch." Before walking away, her chest tightened. If the elders had made their decision, the rest of the village would follow. It wouldn't matter what the human had done. They would take him somewhere quiet, somewhere from which no one returned. As the sun began to set, she left her home, walking quickly to the cemetery. He was there, of course, sitting beside the grave, his coat dusted with dirt. She could see the way his shoulders relaxed when he saw her, but she didn't smile. "They're coming for you," she said, her voice trembling. He didn't look surprised. "I know," he replied simply. She stared at him, frustrated. "Then why are you still here?" He looked at the grave for a long moment before answering. "Because I promised him," he said softly, "that I would watch over you. Until you didn't." "Need me to?" Her throat tightened. "That's not fair," she whispered. "He's gone. You don't have to keep a dead man's promise." He shook his head slowly. "It's not just his promise anymore, it's mine." They both turned when they heard the sound of boots, many of them, approaching along the narrow path. The human stood, moving in front of her without thinking. 5 men came into view, spears in hand, faces hard. The scarred elder from before stepped forward. "It ends tonight," he said, his voice echoing in the cool air. The human's reply was calm. "I'm not leaving her." The elder's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll leave this place in pieces." The first man lunged. The human sidestepped. catching the spear shaft and snapping it in two with a sharp twist. Another came from the side, but the human drove his shoulder into him, sending him sprawling. She pressed her back to the grave. Her heart pounding, the fight was quick, brutal, and silent except for the thud of bodies hitting the dirt. When it was over, 3 of the men lay groaning, the others backing away with fear in their eyes. The elder stared at the human for a long, tense moment. Then he spat on the ground. "You'll regret this," he said, before turning and walking away. The human stood there, chest rising and falling, his knuckles scraped. He turned to her, his voice still steady. "They won't try again tonight." She stepped toward him, her hands shaking. "They'll never stop," she whispered. He met her eyes. "Then we won't stop either." That night, they didn't go back to her home. Instead, they left the village together, walking under the cover of darkness. She carried only the leather pouch, the metal tag, and the clothes on her back. He carried the rest: his silence, his presence, and the quiet certainty that he would keep her safe. By dawn, they had reached the edge of the hills. Below them stretched a long valley dotted with lights from settlements far away. She looked back only once. The village was small in the distance, already fading into the pale morning haze. "I'll never see it again," she said quietly. "You'll see better places," he replied. They made camp on the ridge that night for the first time in years. She spoke of her mate, not just how he died, but how he lived. The human listened without interrupting. When she finally fell silent, he reached into his coat and pulled out the metal tag. "You should keep this close," he said. "But if you ever want me to carry it, I will." She closed her fingers over the tag. "No," she said softly. "It's yours too now." They sat together in the quiet, watching the first stars appear. And though the world beyond the hills was still uncertain, for the first time since she had knelt beside that grave, she felt the weight in her chest lift just enough to let in a little light. The man beside her wasn't the one she had lost, but in his own way, he'd given her back something she thought was gone forever, the belief that her life was worth protecting. And she knew, without doubt,